I was thinking for a while on what I was going to start this out with today. I was thinking of a very imaginative story, and I couldn't come up with one. And so I'm like, this is going to be really horrible. I'm going to talk about the baptized imagination. I have no imagination to do this. And I was talking with my husband. He is harvesting right now as I was preparing for this. He's out in the field, and so we were on the phone, and I said, I'm totally stuck. And he said, Gretchen, with a title like Baptized Imagination, if you don't come right out the gates with baptism, you totally miss an opportunity. So I'm going to submit to my husband and just go straight into the baptism right here. What does it mean to have a baptized imagination? I've had a handful of people ask me this. Do I mean physically a baptized imagination, or spiritually a baptized imagination, as though, God would baptize a portion of us? And do I mean a regenerated imagination? Immediately, the analytical people want to know, at what point in your salvation journey, on a linear level, does our imagination become baptized? These are very rational questions. What did C.S. Lewis mean when he said that his imagination was baptized? The phrase baptized imagination isn't actually a book. This topic is pretty wide open because it's just a phrase that he mentioned in Surprised by Joy. In his particular context, he was talking about when he, as someone who had been baptized as a baby in the Anglican Church, confirmed in the Anglican Church, and then basically a functional agnostic as an adult. He was talking about whenever he read the mythical stories of George MacDonald, he was transformed by the power of myth, of stories, where the possibility of the resurrection became believable. He went from judging the idea of God, of how could this possibly be, to being humbled by the magnitude of a myth that could possibly be true. It was where the beginnings of faith. He was talking about the power of supernatural stories to convey a reality better than critical thinking. The Bible talks about baptism in terms of dying and rising up again. It's being washed in the water and becoming clean. It's when old Adam drowns and new Adam takes a breath. We die in the waters of baptism, and we rise up wearing the righteousness of Christ. We belong to him, and he has given us his name to wear. It's a putting on of Christ. And baptism can be a very sticky subject for a lot of people because it's hard to believe that something supernatural could be going on. We say and act like baptism. Sometimes it must be a symbol of something supernatural. Does God do supernatural things anymore? But we wonder, is it actually not supernatural in and of itself? It's just water. How can water be sacred? Water isn't magical by itself. Water isn't God. Our very struggle with baptism reveals in us how we struggle with the supernatural nature of God and how God works. It's our struggle with believing that something is happening that we cannot see. It's our rational brains taking over and just saying, make it make sense. And telling the part of our brain that believes that God can do anything. We're telling that side of our brain to be quiet and look for the evidence. The rational dominance and the nagging, okay, but we still have to do something. The baptized imagination retrains our brain to look at the truth, at what is the truth deeper than what we can see. Flannery O'Connor says it best. She said, for me, it's the virgin birth, the incarnation, and the resurrection, which are the true laws of the flesh. Death, decay, and destruction are a suspension of those laws. She says what we see is this filter of death. What is real is life. This is the power of fiction. We can have all the rational debates we want, the worldview discussions, the apologetic arguments, but we must never lose sight of the fact that we are called to believe in a God who is not only did he create logic, but he transcends it. We do not believe in a God that we can fully comprehend. Our imagination will fall short, just as our logic will. If we believe baptism is something we do, that we decide, it seems more rational to us, meaning it becomes something we control, we express, we dictate, instead of something God ordains, God expresses. You are mine. I am adopting you. When we think about what is rational, we think about the natural world, and we don't usually consider the supernatural as being natural. We limit it to what we just see and observe. It's hard for us to imagine what is true when we don't see it. We want our fingers in all of it. We want a God we can understand. We want a God we can hold in our hands. Essentially, we want an idol, because idols can be used. They can be managed, can be created to something that we can understand, something we can wrap our minds around. Imagination is required to believe something outside of ourselves. God brings us to the point where we don't just believe what we see, we believe what we cannot see. We believe not what is, but what is possible. Not just what is, but what is possible. Kids have a great imagination. I see imagination up close every day in my own household. They have no trouble believing the impossible. I'll share a little bit about some of my daughters. I have 3 boys and 3 girls. An explanation of my daughters, my oldest daughter gave this description of them. She said, "Mom, I think of each of us girls, if each one of us were a Disney character," I've said this many times, I've quoted her, but she said, "If each one of us were a Disney character, my oldest would be Belle from Beauty and the Beast. She's just a bookworm, always her head in a book. My second oldest would be Rapunzel from Tangled. And then my youngest girl would be Mowgli from The Jungle Book." She's a bit of a spitfire. Her imagination, she's always up trees. She's always talking to animals. That's my youngest Ingrid. She's 10 now. But when she was really little, her imagination was wild. I mean, for most kids, age 3 is when imagination is so intense. It's like their peak imagination. At 3 years old, it's so strong that they struggle to tell the difference between reality and imagination. It's kind of the age of night terrors, because they have dreams and they don't know whether or not they're real. I read once that the author Madeleine L'Engle claimed that she didn't grow out of that phase of not being able to distinguish reality and imagination until she was about age 7, which was later than most kids. And that encouraged me, because my youngest was not growing out of it. She just kept getting bigger, and the imagination just got wilder. And so she would be like 5 years old, and she would tell me about these tiny little baby giants who lived inside of her ear and told her to do weird things. And my husband and I would be looking at each other like, "Is she okay? Like, do we need to like see a doctor? We're just wondering." And she was getting to be 6 years old, and her imagination just still dominated her life. And when she turned 7, she was talking to me one time, and she was like in the zone. She was like in her imaginary world, and I needed her to get to do some chores. And so I kind of entered her imaginary world with her and kind of play acted to get her to do the chore. And she kind of leaned over and she's like, "Mom, you know this is pretend, right?" And then I was like, "Do you know it's pretend?" And she's like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Okay, thank goodness. All right, we're gonna be okay." Relief flooded over me. She can tell the difference. Or ironically, as we guide our kids to be able to tell the difference between reality and imagination, as our baptized imagination brings us back to that childlikeness where anything is possible. At the core of this struggle to believe in the work God does in baptism, it's this rational side of our brain fighting against miracles, thinking we cannot rationally explain things, we cannot put on a clean timeline the works of God. Is the impossible possible for God? Does God use ordinary means for miraculous purposes? Is that rational when you consider who God is? He is the God of creation who attaches his word to any part of his creation. Life just springs forth. That's what baptism is. It's word and water united, water being tangible and his word, which has the power to bring forth life. But as in all discipleship, we must translate this message of faith afresh in every generation. It goes from flesh to flesh, person to person. I was talking with some college professors. My oldest is now in college, and about what college kids are asking these days. What sorts of things are they wrestling with? And they were telling me that college kids are no longer asking, is there a God? They assume that there is a God. They are asking more often now, is God good? They're questioning the goodness of God. They're trying to imagine the goodness of God. They assume there's a higher power out there. And that was really interesting to me. Apologetically, we have gone from wondering if God is real to putting ourselves in the judgment seat to wonder if God is good and worthy of worship. If we accept a God, let it be a tame God, we think. One that we can command, one who does the stuff we want him to do. I wonder what a baptized imagination will mean for this generation. What in our mind must be put to death and be covered with Christ. I've learned that justice is a really big deal for this generation. They don't just want a God, they want a good God. And that's not a bad thing to want. But to create a God in our own likeness, with our own idea of goodness, is idolatry. And in that, we must wrestle with the fact that only Christ is good. And Christ is the only way. Because if Christ is the only way, then a good God would point to that way and discourage all the other ways. A good and just God would say, don't go on the path that leads to death. Go on the path that leads to Christ. That path is Christ. The sin of this world was put on Christ and Christ alone. To be saved is to put on Christ and Christ alone. But that old Adam, he fights. He does not go down easy. There's a wrestling that is normal. If you look throughout the Bible, you will see many people who wrestled with what they deemed as God's goodness and tried to imagine how what God was doing was good. There are passages we read where we wrestle with the goodness of God, and I want to talk about one of those today, because I think that this is an area where we all wrestle at one point or the other. Have you ever been angry with God or thought God was unfair to you or someone that you care about? Have you ever questioned the goodness of God? King David did. We're going to look at probably one of the passages that I struggled with the most, with this idea of I can't imagine that this is something God would do, because it's not my idea of goodness. And we're going to baptize our understanding of it, which means we're going to be putting Christ in the context. So the passage that we're going over is 2 Samuel 6, verses 1 through 11. I won't read it all. I'll kind of paraphrase some of it. This is the fun story of where David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant that had been in captivity back into Jerusalem. He starts a parade. He makes the mistake of putting the Ark on a cart instead of the way that God prescribed it. That it wasn't the Levites carrying it, it was the army just walking alongside of it. But it was like a parade, like David went all out. It says that, and David and the house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord. They got the ark back from the Philistines with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And they all came to the threshing floor of Nacon. Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error. and he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So basically after that, he sends the ark somewhere else because he's like, God is angry with me, and I don't want more people to die. Ironically, it says, and then the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. It wasn't that he was grumpy, it's that he was upset with this situation. God struck down Uzzah, and David thought that was very unfair. In all honesty, it seems a bit of an overreaction to me as well. Uzzah was just trying to help. They weren't following the commands of the Lord, I get that, but it's not like they were being morally horrible. Like, I can think of several things I would want God to strike down people for. Touching the Ark of the Covenant probably wouldn't even be the top 10 or 20 or 50 things that is worth it. Like maybe a slap on a wrist, like maybe he'd get sick, get like leprosy for a little while. Like I understand that, but just striking him down seems very harsh. They used David's men, not the Levites, but it was a long walk. I mean, it's practical, I get that. They were just being very pragmatic about this. Maybe their disobedience was worth something, not that. The anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah for trying to catch the Ark of the Covenant, and he struck him down. Is this the violent Old Testament version of God we tell ourselves? Like, he's obviously not like that anymore. You know, that's what we tell ourselves. There's so many parts of this story that our rational brain makes us think that God is moody. He looks petty. Our rational brains wrestle with it. The Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant on a cart with no poles, and God didn't strike them down. What about Uzzah? Would a good God do that? This is the type of story that would seize fear in my heart. As a child or as a teenager, Uzzah was trying to help God, but he didn't do it exactly right, and he was struck down. That's how I interpreted it. And so if you help God, make sure you do it perfectly because God is watching and he's waiting to strike. So let's talk about the holiness aspect of this because it's connected, of the Ark of the Covenant. Imagine a box overlaid with gold. And inside the box, there were 2 tablets that Moses brought down from Sinai, the second set. It contained the law. The book of Hebrews said it also contained Aaron's staff that had sprouted and a pot of manna from the wilderness. It was basically a place to keep the actual proof that God keeps his promises. It was a box of promise. The Ark of the Covenant was kept in the Holy of Holies, in the most sacred place in the tabernacle, and only the high priest could go in there, and only on the Day of Atonement. The presence of God would rest on this gold-covered box between 2 seraphim, which we often imagine as angels, and it was referred to as the throne of God. Of course, we know from Hebrews that the temple was just a shadow of what was going on in heaven. But this Ark of the Covenant, you could say it was God's box of sacred promises where his presence rested. And imagine what the throne of God was like. And it had a name, the mercy seat of God. It was a place where on the Day of the Atonement, the blood was sprinkled and sins were forgiven. And when God looked down upon the law contained within the box, he would see the blood of atonement sprinkled over, covering the law and forgiving sins. So a box of God's sacred promises of redemption, the lid of it was called the mercy seat. And that sounds wonderful. So why would something called the mercy seat strike you down if you touched it? Like, that doesn't even sound merciful. God's like, this is the mercy seat, but don't touch it or I'll kill you. Like, it just doesn't seem to fit, make it make sense. The holiness of God is particular. It's separate. That means we have sinned. We have separated from God. God made a promise for salvation, and there is no other way to get salvation besides his word. There is a separate, particular way to be saved. One way. The cross is everything, and Jesus had to die. The resurrection would happen. God made a promise that he would redeem. This is a box containing the evidence of his covenant, his unbreakable promise. Salvation will be found in no other way except God himself. That is the promise of this box represented. There is a separate way to God, a holy way to God, no other way. The entire Bible, the entire story of the Bible, the Old Testament through the New Testament, is a story of God saving his people. The story is never about people saving God. He could not allow a story of man saving God. It would confuse generations to come. He could not allow that millstone to be put around so many necks. We don't save God. We don't rescue God. As God does save us, he does let us help with the vocations of loving others as he puts us where he wants us and gives us the works to do. But we don't save God because God cannot fall. God cannot fail. From the time I was 6 years old, I wanted to be a missionary just like my grandpa. I went on mission trips all throughout my teen years, and I traveled to the Philippines and Hong Kong and New Zealand and Australia, and I probably saw about 2,000 people come to faith by the time I was 18. When I started college, I wanted to study linguistics to be a Bible translator. I studied missiology and learned about contextualization, and I was a straight-A student, and I was pretty sure I was going to single-handedly fix missions by myself. I started leading people to Christ by the time I was a small child, and if I were honest, God was pretty lucky to have me. That freshman year of college, there was a chapel speaker who said, let's get this straight right now. We need God. God doesn't need us. Don't let us ever get that backwards, or everything falls apart. And I wrestled with that. I had worked so hard not to need God, but to prove myself to God and to try to be useful to God, to enhance God. Grace was for other people. Me? I earned all this love God gave me. These words that God saves us, we do not save God, that humbled me. I cannot overstate this. I actually dropped out of college for a bit to try to regain some kind of focus and purpose, and it threw me off. And if I'm being honest, I sulked about it for about a good 10 years. What does this mean? And how do I accept it? I thought that God needed my help. I was going to fix what he could not fix. It looks like God hit a bump in the road. I should help him along. I would do it in his name. I'd give him the credit, but he needed the help. Friends, this is how we treat idols. Idols need our help. Idols need propping up. Idols make promises, but really, their people have to actually make it happen. We don't have an idol. We have a living God who came in the flesh, died our death for us, and brought us to new life. We serve a God who baptizes us into his name. There's another story further back in 1 Samuel, which I find humorous, and I'll share it because it's connected here, where the Ark of the Covenant was on another cart with more bumps, and it showed how God can take care of himself just fine. It's worth noting that Israel had lost the Ark of the Covenant in the first place by treating it like an idol. They treated God like their good luck charm. They brought it into battle thinking, this thing is scary. We'll scare off our enemies with this. And we just wave the ark around and we'll win. And the Philistines were terrified. They said they brought their God into the field. But God let Israel lose. They were defeated. Many died, and the Ark of the Covenant was brought into captivity. And the Philistines carried the ark on a cart and put it in their ark in their temple, like their own little God collection. They're like, great, we got another God in our collection here. God is not an idol. He will not be treated as an idol. The narrative is always God saves his people. It is never God's people save God. God cannot be manipulated. God cannot be stolen. God cannot topple. God is not in trouble. When the Ark of the Covenant was stolen in 1 Samuel, and they put it in their temple for their God collection, what was interesting is the Philistines came to check on their plunder in the temple the next day. They found the Ark of the Covenant was there in the temple, but their own God was toppled to the ground. They lifted their idol off the ground, because that's what you do with idols. They can't pick themselves up. And the next day, they came to check on their idol collection, and there was the Ark of the Covenant, and there was the idol not only toppled down, but it was decapitated. Like, God can take care of himself just fine. Uzzah was trying to save God when God does not need saving. He was treating God as an idol that needed to be caught. He saw the box that was supposed to proclaim the promised salvation of God, and Uzzah said, let me help that out a little bit. He tried to manage God because obviously someone needed to manage him. The Ark of the Covenant isn't to be touched. The reason for this isn't because we cannot touch God or God is too distant and holy for us. It's because God's promised plan for redemption involved the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity into flesh and bone. When God redeems us, it will be in the arms of Jesus, not a cold, hard gold box. Jesus, God himself, invites children into his lap. He tells the disciples to touch his hands and to put their hands in his side and feel the wounds. Come, touch the redemption of the Lord, bought through the death and resurrection of Christ. God's promise is particular. It will be through Christ and Christ alone. Christ would put on flesh and dwell among us and make a way through the cross to redeem us. And it will be his blood that will be sprinkled to cover the law and make permanent atonement, because God keeps his promises. And when he does so, he does it in abundance. Let it be known that God does not look like other gods in the world, and he will not be treated as other gods in the world. And this is for our good, because no other God can save. He will remove any method of salvation in our lives that doesn't work, that leaves him. What is a baptized imagination? It's a view of God that our rational minds wrestle to see because we filter our reality through the world of death and destruction. A baptized imagination doesn't just take off the filter of sin that we taint our reality with, and it doesn't just throw it away, it drowns it and destroys it so that we can see with the eyes of faith, of life, the eyes of the possible, eyes that are fixed on Jesus, on Christ alone. There's this moment in Narnia, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Aslan goes into the White Witch's palace, and all the creatures were turned into stone, and the palace is filled with statues of everyone who had been caught in the White Witch's trap. And he goes over to them and he breathes on them. And the stone becomes flesh and awakens to new life. And he is not an idol. We are. We are the ones made of stone that need to be turned to flesh with the breath of God. We are the dead who need new life. We are the dirty who need to be washed. His salvation does not need our help. He is not so weak that we need to pick him up off the floor. He will not be treated as an idol, as something we manage, that we manipulate for our favor, for the things that we want. He is the living God, and he keeps his promises.